This lecture is the last one I'm going to give before we start talking about the Gospels. So on Thursday we're going to start on the Gospels. We'll start with the Gospel of John. This is kind of an introduction because I want you guys to understand how I read the Gospels and why. And I also want you to understand a little bit about how New Testament scholars, Gospel scholars, how they read the Gospels and why. What has happened since 1750 that has affected the way they read the Gospels? And entire books are written about this subject. I'm giving you 2 lectures on it, but I'm giving you, I think, what I consider to be sort of the gist of what has happened in 250 years of gospel scholarship and history of Jesus research. And so this is important for me. It might be a little bit dry because this kind of subject always is, but let me start out by saying something positive about all of this stuff that we're going to talk about, okay? You can title this Cruising Through Critical Inquiry. I know all the Bible classes at Azusa or wherever they're taught, they start out by talking about critical scholarship, like these guys have reached conclusive and incontrovertible conclusions about all these materials. The point is, they haven't. It's a discourse. It's a dialogue. It's sort of a living thing, and it's the process of them asking questions and getting and arriving at answers. Some of the answers are good. Some of them aren't so good. Remember, I told you last class period that the historical critical period started around 1750, maybe technically about 1778, and it ended in 1906 with the publication by Albert Schweitzer of The Quest of the Historical Jesus, where he showed, after reading thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of historical analysis of the Gospels, concluding that all of the major contributors were actually producing reflections of themselves in Jesus, which, if you think about it, is kind of interesting. One of the things that Albert Schweitzer says at the beginning of his book is the most difficult thing to do is write a life of Jesus. He has shown in his book how all of these scholars who were trying to write objective history were being totally subjective themselves. It's a very difficult thing to do. Especially, maybe it's just because so much is at stake with Jesus. So much is invested in who he is and the impact that he's had on Western civilization and human history. So I'm going to give you a rundown of it since 1750. We've got to start on the last class period. The points that I want to make, and I'll state them right now, but I'm going to go back to them occasionally, but I want you to get this. The point is that critical doesn't always mean hostile, okay? Usually, at least when I started studying biblical studies and I heard about biblical criticism, the angle that I always heard was that this is hostile. This is a hostile approach to a sacred text. Sometimes it is, because some of these scholars, most of these scholars who became famous in the 19th, 20th century, most of them were, in fact, raised in a conservative theological home. They were the sons of pastors. Their family had a long history of clergymen in the church, whether it's Protestant or Roman Catholic or Reformed. And a lot of these guys were venting I think. Do we have any pastors' kids in here? Just Spencer, the one running the camera, his father's a pastor. Oh, you should hear him vent about his family. No, I'm just kidding. Spencer doesn't. But okay, a lot of these guys vent. They're venting. They have a chip on their shoulder for whatever reason, okay? And some of their scholarship is affected by that. But what I have found to be true most of the time is that this isn't an enterprise that's being controlled by hostile criticism. It's being controlled by honest questions. And most of the questions that are asked by these biblical scholars that we have sometimes seen as brethren who have strayed from orthodoxy. What they have more often than not been doing is asking honest questions and seeking satisfying answers. And so you might say that it is just as true about these guys that they were not afraid of the truth. Critical doesn't mean hostile, it means analytical. An art critic isn't somebody who goes into a museum and slashes pictures or bashes statues, okay? An art critic is someone who interprets art, appreciates art. That's an art critic. A literary critic, somebody who analyzes, appreciates literature. That's the way that I'm using this term, okay? In its nicest sense, as an analysis. What is also true of these guys is that no issue was spared and no rock was left unturned. If you read Schweitzer's book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, you'll see they left no rock unturned, no question unasked. You'll also see that most of the questions that they asked were honest questions. And one of the hardest things for me to do when I started studying the Gospels was it was really hard for me to assume the integrity of critical scholars. But I have gotten to the point where I do. I don't accept their conclusions, but I assume that they're working with integrity. And that was an important point for me to get to. I also can say with confidence that in this process, where a lot of there was a lot of bashing of orthodoxy during the historical critical period of the 19th century. There was a lot of serious bashing of orthodoxy. There was also genuine progress made. And I'm not always right either. My motives aren't always pure either. My results aren't always God-honoring either. And so I give these guys a little bit of credit for working with some integrity, and I've tried to where I can. I've tried to point out where they made genuine progress. And believe it or not, when we get to the end of the day, so to speak, where they ended up around 1950, 1960, 1970, with this method, and this is where we'll end up, when they get to this point, they have actually arrived at a method of reading the Gospels that is fruitful beyond anyone's imagination. And so all of this journey through all of these hard questions, hard issues, and sometimes hostile spirits, we get to a point that is worth getting to. Okay, so let me just review again. We started with historical criticism. We got partially through source criticism last Thursday. Let me sum up a little bit. Historical critics, post-Enlightenment historians were interested in one thing. You got anybody remember? What was the question that they sought to answer? What really happened? For example, in Matthew, we have the temptation narrative where Jesus is being tempted by the devil in Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. And he goes through three temptations. There's the temptation to turn stones into loaves of bread. There's the temptation to jump off the pinnacle of the temple and sort of dare the angels to catch you. So there's this suicide test. Okay, and then the last one is the worship of the devil. So those three tests occur in Matthew, in that order. Now when you get to Luke chapter 4, we have the same three tests, except the order changes. Luke has changed the order. Test number 2 and 3 are reversed, so that in Luke, the last test is the one where he's tempted to jump off the temple and commit suicide. So, which order is right? They can't both be right. They can't. One order is wrong. One of the writers changed the order. Who changed it? And why? See, that's kind of the questions they asked, okay? Here we've got this. This writer says it happened in this order. This writer says it happened in this order. What really happened? That's what they want to know. What really happened? Okay? They weren't necessarily interested in much else, okay? You might say that their interests were pretty narrow, pretty focused. They wanted to know, they wanted to retrieve pure, unadulterated historical data. And that can be very boring. But that's what they were after. I suggested there were some good things about what they were doing. They asked questions that others hadn't asked. Okay, that was good. They started seeing things that hadn't been seen before because they were looking for historical consistency. So they saw things that hadn't really been noticed before. The con, the negative, is that they seem to be working with a set of presuppositions that were reflections of their modern, post-Enlightenment, scientific worldview. We might call this that they were working with a closed system. And if you think about it, guys, you got to see that modern science presupposes a closed system. Okay, that's why we spend so much time in science classes in the laboratory. That's why we test drugs for their effect on human beings, because we believe in a closed system. Laws of nature, of cause and effect. We know that if people take this drug, it'll kill them because we gave it to 10 people and 10 people died. So don't take this drug. Okay? That kind of thing. Closed system. The law of cause and effect. What happened yesterday will happen today as well. What happened in the laboratory will happen in the street. And that was the value of the laboratory. They could actually depend on the fact that situations, results could be reduplicated in another place. Modern medicine is built on this closed system. So is everything that we almost experience in this room. The lights. You know, when we walked in, it was dark. We turned the light switches on. We knew what would happen. The lights would come on. The reason the lights came on was because they wired them to electricity. All of this stuff. I mean, most of the conveniences that we experience are because of this presupposition of a closed system. Cause and effect. What they also did with this closed system is they excluded any interference from the outside, like from the supernatural world. They assumed the non-existence of this in their assumption of the existence of this. Now, I know this is a hard one for us to get over, but they actually depended a lot on this exclusion and inclusion part of their methodology. Because if miraculous things happened in the past and they're not happening today, that means they didn't happen in the past. So reports of miraculous things happening in the past have to be explained otherwise, in some other way. And so a lot of the books on the historical Jesus are just elaborate. Some of them are very elaborate explanations of things that historical critics have ruled out at the presuppositional level. That was probably a weakness. In my opinion, that was a weakness of the method. I'm rather fond of the supernatural myself. I've told you before, I think that it's almost an indictment against us, that we think that nothing can exist if it's outside our realm of sense perception. It's almost like we're defining reality and truth by ourselves. And if we can't see it or experience it, it doesn't exist. That's sort of presumptuous. It's especially presumptuous to people who have experienced the supernatural. And I know people who have. I'm a little bit of a skeptic when it comes to miracles, okay? Because I don't think that miracles are just, handed out cheaply to everyone who asks. I know that for a fact. I've had epilepsy since I was 13 years old. Sure, I'd like to be healed. And yeah, I have asked. I've even had the elders in my church, not the church where I go now, but I've had the elders pray over me, seeking all of the guidelines in asking God to do this for me. And He never did it. It was especially hard, believe me, because when I was in 8th grade, I don't know if you guys remember being in 8th grade. You know how important a social life is to an 8th grader? Well, imagine what it's like for somebody who, in the middle of the day, in the middle of the gymnasium, might all of a sudden fall down and have a grand mal seizure in front of everybody else. Kids don't understand that, but it happened to me. When I would have a seizure about every 6 months, even with medication. I don't have the problem anymore because in the 1980s, a drug was approved by the FDA called Tegretol, which wasn't approved by the FDA when I was diagnosed as an epileptic. I started taking Tegretol, and it controls my seizures completely. Completely. That was like so cool. You guys couldn't imagine. You couldn't imagine. But I'll tell you one thing I didn't do. I was watching Oral Roberts on the television, and he said, there are people out there who need to be healed. If you need to be healed, I want you to touch your TV tube right now. And I said, no. I'm not going to touch my television set and get healed. But I've had people tell me that I didn't have the right people praying for me, that I wasn't praying enough, that I had sin in my life, blah, 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 okay? Well, what if it's just this? I said, God, I'd like to be healed, and God says, no. I got other plans for you. What about that? Well, there are Christians that say, God wouldn't say that. And you're left with kind of a conundrum. Okay, God wouldn't say that. Well, except He did. So what? I worked for a guy in Omaha, Nebraska. I'm a carpenter, worked my way through school. This guy was a construction contractor, owned a construction company. And he was a Christian brother, believed he had the gift of healing. And I told him over the phone when we were talking about me being hired by him, I told him I had epilepsy and stuff. And he goes, oh, I'd like to get my hands on you. And I thought, okay, what does that mean? And so, I said, really, it's okay, Ted. I'm okay with this. I've lived with it a long time. It has actually become useful in the hands of God in my life. But he could never understand that. He said, that's not God's will. God wants you to be whole. And I would say, well, I am whole, Ted. I am. Very whole. And he wouldn't believe that. He couldn't accept that. I can remember one day, we were working, and he said, Mike, you want a piece of gum? And I said, no, I don't chew gum. He goes, why? I said, because it gives me a headache. The constant, the temples, okay? So I don't chew gum, or at least not a lot. And he said, he just looked at me and he goes, that's wrong. He said, everybody should be able to enjoy gum. Everybody should be able to enjoy gum. And I said, Ted, really, it's okay. Do you have any lifesavers? And he's like, God wants you to be whole. And we went through the whole thing again. And it's like, Ted, it's okay, really. It's okay. Yes?
What would you say then in response to, like, this situation we kind of treated, like this one that to my flesh and to know my way to well, then when he say that, God was wrong or I don't know, I mean, there's clearly indications in Scripture where God is designed for somebody not to be.
Sure.
So how could somebody, from a biblical or even theological standpoint say that?
Sure, good question. Did you guys hear what she said? She said, how then would he explain something like, it's in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, when Paul says, I asked 3 times that this thorn be removed, and God said, no, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power will be perfected in weakness. And it's a beautiful passage, but obviously, no theological position is airtight, and we all have our problem passages, right? And they have, I'm sure, a creative explanation for that as well. So that's, I'm not really sure how he would answer that. It's a good question. Or Timothy, when Timothy, had stomach problems and Paul told him to drink wine for his stomach because the water was bad, And so why didn't Paul just, okay, you got a problem, Timothy? Healed him through the mail, whatever. You see, I don't think that being a complete and whole human being means that you no longer experience suffering. How do you explain the fact that that's all Jesus promises us, is suffering? We're going to look at that when we look at the Gospel of Mark. Or death. We're all going to die. I remember once we were on the way to a job, and there's some things that I really liked about Ted. He was he had such a sweet heart, such a compassion for people. Okay? We were on the way to a job, and this emergency vehicle went by, EMT, going to an accident or something. And right away, Ted pulls off the road, and we prayed for the EMTs, the technicians. We prayed for the people that were hurt, and I just thought that was cool. He would just take time immediately and bring these things to God in prayer, and that was really cool. But one time, he said, and it was over the news that there was and I lived in Omaha. Okay, Omaha is sort of like in the middle of Tornado Alley. So if you grew up in Nebraska, where I grew up, you're as used to tornadoes as Californians are used to earthquakes. Okay? And I've seen a lot of tornadoes in my day. But anyway, this over the radio there was a weather report that there was a tornado in this little town outside of Omaha called Wahoo. That was really the name of the town, Wahoo. Anyway, so there's a tornado in Wahoo, and Ted stopped and he prayed. And I said, I stopped, and when he was done, I said, Ted, I really don't understand why you treat tornadoes as though they were from the devil. I said, because my aunts and my uncles, my grandparents, my mom and my dad that grew up on farms, let me tell you what a tornado means to a farmer, okay? This guy might have 40 acres of corn, and the tornado might touch down and destroy 15 acres of that 40-acre corn. But you know what usually comes with a tornado? About 2 inches of rain. Do you know what 2 inches of rain means to a dryland farmer? The difference between just being able to pay the seed bills and what it costs to plant the corn and actually coming out at the end of the year with a profit so that he can buy things for his family. That's the difference. So I said, Ted, you explain to me where the devil starts and God, or where the devil stops and God starts. When is the tornado not from the devil, but rather from God? And he goes, oh, I don't know. And I thought, well, see, that's the problem with you. Not to be vicious or anything, but that's just the problem with you, Ted. You don't think these things through. Okay, you think that everything is so simple. But it's really not. Because I know what a 2-inch rain means to a farmer, even if he loses 15 acres of corn from a tornado touching down. So he was ready to call something totally evil, which actually represented something totally good, to somebody else. You see what I'm saying? Sometimes our take on the world, and this is something you guys are going to have to pay attention to as you grow up and become adults, that life and some of the issues that you're going to deal with in life are always not so simple. Like, it isn't just a matter of, I have epilepsy, okay, be healed. Maybe God has something planned for me. Maybe this is just a critical element in my life that He's going to use to make me into something productive. I think he has used it. How did we get on this subject? Huh? The supernatural. So just because I haven't been healed doesn't mean I don't believe in miracles. Okay? Because I had a history professor in college, and I went to the University of Nebraska. This history professor we had a name for him. I mean, I was in InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. All the Christian kids, students, we had a name for this guy. He was the Christian killer. Okay? He sort of made it his goal to make you feel as stupid as possible if you were a Christian. And he was nevertheless the best history professor on campus, and I had a history minor, so I took everything I could from him. I wrote papers for him, and he would say things like, brilliant, but my, what a sermon. That's what he would say. In fact, that's what he wrote on one paper. Brilliant, but my, what a sermon. And I thought, it's okay. I like this guy. He was really good, okay? I found out some things about this professor. His name was Nels Ferdy. He was about this tall. And have you ever seen pictures of ancient Sumerians? They had beards. The men would have beards, and they would shave their jaw all the way to the point of their bottom jawline. Then they would have a beard from here down. Have you ever seen pictures like that? Well, anyway, this is the beard he had. He was shaved clean from here down to here, and then he had this long beard, and his hair was gray, and he was a little guy, looked like a leprechaun. And he would, when he would lecture, he'd walk back and forth in front of the class like this, bouncing on his feet. And every once in a while, he'd look at his notes, as he was walking back and forth. And our seats were always in single file, and I had 4 guys that I was living with that we were all taking history classes, and we all took every class Ferdy taught. Ancient civilization, rise and fall of the Roman Empire, Hebrew heritage, whatever he took, ancient Sumerian, we would take. This one guy, Mike Meyer, a roommate of mine, he was not as good a student. I mean, he'd come to class and sleep. You guys ever do that? Not in my class, right? He would come to class and sleep. And this one day, he was sitting right in front of me, and right in front of him was Mark, one of my other roommates. But Mike is sitting there, and pretty soon, we know he's asleep because he's nodding off, but pretty soon his head is down on his chest, and then all of a sudden, Mike goes like this. He leans out into the aisle, and he's asleep, and he's snoring. And Ferdy's walking back and forth, and every time he walks by that row, he stops and he looks at Meyer. And we should have woke him up, right? But no, you don't ruin a moment like that. You let that happen. We let him sleep. Man, that was funny. But Ferdy let it happen too. He never said anything. Just let the guy snore in his classroom. So Ferdy, I found out later, had a brother who was a Missouri Synod Lutheran minister. And he had a father who was a Missouri Synod Lutheran minister. And he was attending a Missouri Synod Lutheran seminary to become a Missouri Synod Lutheran minister. When something happened, I don't know what, something happened. He dropped out of that, entered a secular university, got a PhD in ancient history, and he became a very well-known ancient historian. He was the only professor in the Midwest who could read cuneiform. Smart guy. But I didn't know that about Ferdy until after I graduated. And I had a friend who was still at the school, and we were writing back and forth, and he wrote me a letter, and he said, "You'll never guess what happened to Ferdy." So he told me the whole story. And he said that his wife, like 3 months ago, was diagnosed with terminal cancer. They took her in. She was full of cancer from her top of her head to tip of her toes. She was filled with cancer. And so this friend of mine, he said, me and 2 other guys that were in the class, we went up to him. We told him that we knew what was going on. We said we were going to pray for his wife. That took some guts. Okay? So they started praying for his wife. The next time his wife went to the doctor, she was cancer-free. Guess what happened to Ferdy? He got on his knees. A 55-year-old ancient history professor with a PhD teaching at a secular university gave his life to Jesus. I know miracles happen. I just think that God is very selective. They aren't cheap things. I also had a good friend who was a carpenter, and he was my pastor. We worked together, and his wife was a missionary kid in India. And one day I was talking to her, and she was telling me about how once when they were in the mission field, they were hundreds of miles from a medical clinic. She fell and cut her eye and almost cut her eyelid off. Her father put his hand over her eye and prayed for her. Took his hand away, and the eye was healed. And she said, "That happened to me. I was a little girl. I remember it." She even showed me the scar on her eyelid. I believe that God does miracles. I believe that God enters into this world of ours and changes things sometimes. I just don't think that it happens as totally often as some of us think, sort of reducing the significance of the moment to some sort of I don't know. This was their presupposition, though, that there was no supernatural. I got to tell you one more story. I just thought of it. I had a good friend who we were in college together. We went to graduate school together. And when he was in his second year working on a PhD, his father got cancer. And so his father was a farmer in Nebraska City, in Nebraska. So he had to leave graduate school and go home, and he ran the family farm. He just put everything behind him, went home and took care of his family farm. His dad, his mom. And pretty soon, one of the churches in the town where they lived needed a pastor, so that he was hired as pastor. Had an unbelievable ministry with people in that town because he was a very smart guy. He was a good teacher, wonderful human being. Well, about 3 years after his pastoral ministry started in that town, he got diagnosed with brain cancer. They found a tumor on his head. on his brain. And they started treating it with chemotherapy and radiation. And Alan, his name was Alan Schmidt. Alan was unbelievable throughout the whole thing. He had 4 children, all just little kids. But he was unbelievable through this whole thing. I mean, he knew Hebrew very well. He was working on a PhD in Hebrew. He knew the Psalms. Most of the Psalms, he knew them by heart in Hebrew. And he would sing them in Hebrew. I would go to visit him at the hospital, and I would hear this song coming down the hallway. Alan singing the Psalms in Hebrew. It was beautiful. He impacted the nurses that worked on that floor in amazing ways. You know, they did a full-page article on him in the Omaha World Herald. Now, the Omaha World Herald, Omaha is you think Omaha is just a little cow town, right? But in Nebraska, Omaha is the big city. It's the biggest town in Omaha, in Nebraska. Maybe 500,000 people. The newspaper in Omaha is the Omaha World Herald. They did a full-page story on Alan when he was in the hospital. Full-page story. They interviewed him. He glorified God. It was amazing. Guy is on his deathbed. He's a month away from death, dying. He's got children that he's not going to see grow up. And he's just singing psalms. Really kind of an amazing guy. And you would think, God, heal him, stop this. Well, one day I was in his hospital room, and his sister walks in. And his sister says, Alan, I have good news. She goes, I was praying with my prayer partner this morning. I was praying in tongues, and the Lord told me that he was going to heal you. And Alan's like, cool, And I was there, and I heard that, and I thought, not cool. Can't you see the Lord is doing something beautiful right here? Using this. He's doing something beautiful, changing people's lives. And I didn't say anything, and neither did Alan. He died about 10 days later. And I thought, what does she think right now when she thought that the only way that God could demonstrate his presence in this situation is by healing him of his brain cancer? That's what she thought. That's just totally wrong, guys. That is not the only way that God demonstrates his presence in a situation. An illness. Pain. Sometimes pain is there because God is there. Have you ever thought of that? Well, anyway, their presupposition was this closed system, and God wasn't allowed in. So they ruled him out. They ruled out the supernatural by definition. This historical criticism led to source criticism, and we talked about how they tried to figure out whether Matthew, Mark, or Luke was written first. And remember last week we talked about how they compared Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They decided that based upon the data, Mark was the oldest gospel. And so the question that the source critics asked was, who wrote first? Matthew, Mark, or Luke? The answer that they gave was Mark. But you see, they were still interested in this question. That's the reason they wanted to know who was the first gospel. Because they thought if they could get to the oldest gospel, they would be that much closer to the events. That was their interest. They still were interested in history. The good things that came from source criticism are that they gave some order and process to our understanding of the composition of the Gospels, because they asked questions that nobody was asking, okay? And they figured out that Matthew and Luke used Mark, that they actually did research, that they actually went through a process before they composed their documents. They also, in the process of analyzing all this, they also focused on small pieces. Pericopes, paragraphs, like the healing of the centurion's servant, that pericope, that episode. They focused on these episodes in an independent way to try and understand more about them. So the pericopes were isolated. They eventually, because of this, they drew our attention to the pre-literary stage. In other words, before all of this stuff was written down, it was told orally. It existed in the preaching of the early church, in the memory of the people who experienced it. It had a life before it was committed to writing. They drew our attention to that, to the pre-literary stage. Eventually, this led to what is called form criticism. Form criticism is a focus upon the pre-literary stage of the gospel material. The question, as I have it written in the course pack, is they asked, what can we learn about the pre-literary period of these Jesus tradition? So the focus turned to the form of the individual stories, and hence gave birth to form criticism, the study of oral tradition. Some good things came from form criticism. For example, they noticed that some stories told about Jesus were healing stories. Some stories were controversy stories. And when they took all the healing stories, all the controversy stories, all these stories that had different characteristics in common, when they took them and put them together, they exhibited a lot of the same characteristics. And that meant that when this material was used in preaching, as it was remembered, it was remembered in this form. Hence, Formgeschichte, form history, form criticism. And form critics believed that the more we understand about the form, the better we'll understand the function that the story had. There were three good things about form criticism. Number one, there are three sane conclusions. They concluded that small units had an independent history. That was a good conclusion. That was valid. Do you remember at the beginning of the class when I asked various people in the class to read all the words of Jesus in Mark, all the words in Luke, all the words in Matthew? And you came back, some of you said, it took you an hour, hour and a half, 45 minutes to read all the words of Jesus in a gospel. That was one way for me to make this point, that the gospel writers collapsed their material into a story form that could be told, read, recited in a couple of hours. Before they wrote these Gospels pieces, these small units had an independent history. The second sane conclusion is that the Gospel writers were collectors. They viewed the Gospel writers as collectors, okay? Guys who just collected data so that they could write, okay? And I guess that's true. They did. They collected information. They collected these stories, and then they wrote their narrative. Some examples of this being true, look at Mark chapter 4. Mark chapter 4 is a collection within the larger Gospel of Mark. It's a collection of a series of parables. What, do you think Jesus just one day decided to teach a bunch of parables, and the next day not? Or do you think maybe the Gospel writers took parables, made a parable collection? What about this? Mark chapter 13. Here's another chapter collecting the teaching of Jesus. Just so happens that this might in fact have, this is the Olivet Discourse, the eschatological discourse, where Jesus talks about the end times. This probably was a discourse that was given at a point close to his resurrection. But look at these, guys. Here we're moving outside of the Gospels. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 12. Here's a couple of places in one of Paul's letters where he gives us sayings of Jesus. Now the topic of discussion in 1 Corinthians 7 is marriage. So isn't it interesting that when discussing this topic of marriage, Paul uses this saying of Jesus related to this topic, and this saying related to this topic. This demonstrates, guys, the way that these traditions of Jesus' teaching were remembered and used by the early church in preaching. Hence, sane conclusion number 3. The value of a tradition or a story about Jesus or a story of his teaching, the value of it is directly proportional to its relevance for the early community. That's a sane conclusion. Unfortunately, some form critics felt that the early church just created all of this stuff because they had need of it. They needed help from Jesus dealing with this issue, so they made up some sayings of Jesus for that purpose. That's really hard to maintain because we know that one of the critical issues in the early church was circumcision, and yet we have no sayings of Jesus about circumcision. It would have been a good opportunity for them to have used the teacher and his authority to settle an issue. They never did that. There are lots of reasons to think that this tradition was sacred to them, and they wouldn't make things up. In fact, even in this passage, 1 Corinthians 7, Paul is careful to distinguish his perspective and opinion from Jesus. So these are 3 sane conclusions. The negative side of form criticism is that it produced unbelievable skepticism. I mean, when they saw that the gospel writers took these pericopes and used them in a narrative that was in many ways artificial, they thought that this brings an end to our quest for the historical Jesus, because we can't know anything about Jesus since the early church used traditions about him so freely. Let me read you a couple of quotes from some form critics. This one is by Rudolf Bultmann, who was really one of the fathers of form criticism, probably one of the best form critics, and maybe one of the smartest New Testament theologians in the early 20th century. Here's what he says: "I do indeed think that we can now know almost nothing concerning the life and personality of Jesus, since the early Christian sources show no interest in either. They are, moreover, fragmentary and legendary, and other sources about Jesus do not exist." Listen to this one. This is by Louise Schautroff. She's also a well-known New Testament scholar and form critic. She says this in her book, Jesus and the Hope of the Poor: "Apart from his death by crucifixion, hardly any details about the historical Jesus can be claimed as historically certain. In particular, it is almost futile to attempt to prove the historical authenticity of any of the sayings of Jesus that are transmitted in the gospel tradition." Oh, jeez. That's severe. "It is futile because the synoptic gospels speak of the Jesus who is an object of faith and not the historical Jesus in the modern sense of the term." Well, there's some truth to that. But you see how they have become very skeptical. Here's another statement from a New Testament scholar whose name was T.W. Manson, professor of New Testament exegesis at the University of Manchester. He said, and this is good, guys, this is good. He said, "If form criticism had stuck to its proper business, it would not have made any real stir." Guess what Manson is saying? Is that the conclusions that form criticism left us with are good, some valid insights. But the skepticism that it produced, the historical skepticism, was completely unrelated to the method or the data that it presented. It did not provide proof of such a thoroughgoing historical skepticism. That was rather the possession of the form critics themselves. So anyway, this is good. This is good. What's what happened is form criticism between 1906 and 1950 brought an end to the quest of the historical Jesus. It seemed like the skeptics had sort of won the day, that their skepticism, their pessimism regarding these documents as being just mere reflections of the early Christians and nothing substantially reflecting Jesus at all, they sort of won. And that's why they say that during the period of form criticism between 1906 and 1950, there was no quest of the historical Jesus because scholars had given up. But there was even something good about that. There's even something good about that. Because the whole thing was sort of brought up for discussion all over again around 1950. Form criticism gave birth to redaction criticism. Redaction criticism, redaction is a word that simply means editor. Redaction critics, and redaction criticism is actually a method that I use when I read the Gospels. They have a one of the ways of defining redaction criticism is by comparing it to form criticism, sort of in an antithesis kind of way. Form criticism said that the authors of the Gospels were collectors. Redaction criticism said they weren't just collectors, they were authors. Form critics said that all of this material is controlled by randomness. Redaction critics said, no, it's controlled by purpose and intent. Form critics said that the pericopes, the traditions, were simply snapshots of disjointed recollection. Snapshots of disjointed recollection. That's how they perceived Mark. Disjointed recollections and snapshots. Redaction critics said, no, the gospel writers were narrative theologians. So redaction critics say this in response to form criticism. They weren't collectors, they were authors. They weren't controlled by randomness, but by purpose and intent. They weren't just snapshots of disjointed recollection, they were narrative theologians. You know what the form critics did? They took the Gospel of Mark, for example, and they broke him into just a series of connected, random episodes, pericopes, randomly put together. And so they thought that what is most important to do with Mark, since our interest is history, is to just cut these all apart and examine them individually. So they cut Mark all up. They cut him into pieces, let's say 150 pieces, and they spread him out all over the table. So we've got over here, we've got the parables, we've got the controversy stories, we've got the healing stories, the exorcisms, we've got the pronouncement stories, and blah, 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 blah. And they had them all cut up, separated. And where's Mark? Well, he's kind of there, but he's all cut up. But they didn't think that was a great loss because they thought that the gospel writers were basically just scissors and paste guys anyway. Clip, clip, clip. Tape this, clip, clip, glue this, clip, 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 tape, glue, you know? Okay? That was their image of the gospel writers. So nothing was really lost in cutting them up and looking at the individual traditions. But their conclusion at the end of all that was that what we have is just a bunch of unconnected, random, traditional recollections that do nothing for us, historically speaking. The redaction critics came in and they took all the pieces, they gathered them all together, and they put them back in order the way Mark had them. That's what they did. They put them back and they said, you know what? What's important here isn't the little pieces. What's important is the whole story. That's what's important. And what we need to pay attention to is the intentions and the theological purposes and accomplishments of Mark, who put this all together in a story form for us. Hence, they treat Mark as an editor, not a collector. As an author, not just a scissors and paste person. And at the end of the day, what they've done is they've put the Gospels back together for us. Now we're dealing not with the individual pieces, but we're dealing now with the text, with the story. For redaction critics, the story is everything. Story is everything. You see, in a sense, guys, we've come full circle. We've come back. Critical scholarship has come back, and they've recognized Matthew is worth having. Mark is worth having. Luke is worth having. And we need to learn how to listen to them. They're storytellers. We've forgotten how to listen to a story. We dissected them. We slaughtered them. We criticized them. We accused them of prejudice. We accused them of being historical iconoclasts. We've accused them of countless other things. And essentially what we only succeeded in doing was silencing them. And all they wanted to do was tell us the story. So redaction critics starting in 1950 started listening to the story again. And it's amazing. Once they started listening, it's amazing some of the things they heard. It's amazing how good these guys really were at telling a story. It's amazing at some of the things they accomplished in their storytelling technique. Let me show you just one example, okay? It's in the course pack. It's on page 55. Turn to page 55 in your course pack. I'm sorry, 53. Page 53. I want to show you this, explain this to you, and then I'll let you go today. Mark's episodic style. One of the conclusions that redaction critics have made after listening closely and reverently to Mark is that he had his own style of telling a story. And it wasn't, first impressions of this style are that he wasn't very good at telling a story. But the more they listened, the more they watched, and the more they paid attention, the more they realized that, hey, Mark's not bad. In fact, he's pretty good. Look at what he does. They call it an episodic style. Basically, what Mark does is he takes one episode, and then right next to it, he places another episode. And his reason for this kind of juxtaposition is so that when you read one, you will be thinking about the other, and vice versa. So that he's actually asking you to have these two episodes in dialogue with each other. This was actually accomplished, in fact, in ancient theater on the Greek stage. The Greek drama went through many stages, but at some point they would divide the stage and they would have two things happening at the same time. And you in the audience, you're watching these two things these two dramatizations being done at the same time, you can't help but play them against each other. And that's what the playwrights wanted you to do. They just had a very visual way of accomplishing it. Some people think that Mark was written to be done on a stage. But look at this. I've got two of them. Pretend this is a split stage, okay? We've got two trials going on here. There's Jesus' trial in chapter 14, verses 53 to 65. Right next to it, the next set of verses, is Peter's trial. So there's two trials going on. Jesus is being tried, Peter is being tried. You know, it's amazing what happens when you read these things and look at them side by side. Because on Jesus' trial, he's being asked who he is by the high priest. He's being asked who he is. You know, this is the first time in Mark's gospel where Jesus admits who he is. The high priest says, "Are you the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus says, "I am." It's the first time in the gospel he's done that. Powerful moment in this text. Very powerful. Jesus finally admits who he is. He's been asking everybody. Remember, chapter 8, he says, "Hey, who do people say that I am?" They say, you know, this and this and this. And then he says, well, who do you say that I am? Finally, we get Jesus saying who he is in chapter 14. So he tells the truth. He admits who he is. This means certain death because he's immediately accused of blasphemy. Then he's mocked as a prophet in this passage. Okay? So all this is going on over here. He tells the truth. He admits who he is. He's mocked as a prophet. And as soon as he's mocked as a prophet, he prophesies again. So what do you think is happening over on this side of the stage? Peter's on trial. They're asking Peter who he is. He denies who he is 3 times. "Hey, weren't you with him?" "Nah." "Hey, aren't you from Galilee? Weren't you with him?" "No." He denies who he is 3 times. To save his own skin, okay? To save his own life. So he denies who he is to save his own life. Jesus is over here admitting who he is, securing his own death. Then at the very end, when Peter finally denies 3 times, there's a cock that crows. And at the moment the cock crows, Jesus is being mocked over here as a prophet. You guys see what's going on here? Boom, 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 boom. Prophecy fulfilled, mocked as a prophet. Now you're watching this, you know who Jesus is. He's being mocked as a prophet, but right there is a prophecy being fulfilled. And as soon as he's mocked as a prophet and you hear the cock crow, Jesus prophesies again. This way of telling the story is filled with power. Who's the hero in this story? Jesus is. He answers the tough questions, even though it means his own death. Now, Peter over here, he's the coward. Don't be like him. We're going to find that's true in the Gospel of Mark. Don't be like the 12 disciples, okay? Don't be like them. They're not the heroes of the story. Jesus is the hero. This is his episodic style. This is the way you have to read Mark. And so you'll have to wait until we get to Mark before you get more of this. So I'll see you guys on Thursday.